Good evening, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and today we're talking about that time when Americans fought a rebellion over whiskey. Yes, that's a thing. If there's one thing Americans like more than freedom, it's alcohol. If prohibition is anything to go by, Americans, we like our booze. And in colonial America, there were two or three that were extremely common: cider, ale, and whiskey. And the reason these three were extremely popular in America, and we'll go ahead and show a glass of a whiskey on the rocks. The reason these three were popular in America was they were easy to produce. Ale is a grain beer. It's, for all intents and purposes, it's a beer. Cider is made with apples, traditionally, which are very common here in North America and in the States particularly. And of course, wheat was extremely readily grown, and whiskey can be made by any grain. You essentially let it germinate, you compound it, and press it, and toast it and flood it, and allow it to germinate in the water. And with a little bit of yeast, you produce a mash, which consumes on the sugars from the grain, and this mash is then aged in oak barrels until it reaches what we would now call 80 proof or 40% ABV, alcohol by volume. So yeah, it's a pretty potent drink, but there's actually a reason for this, and this primarily took place in western Pennsylvania, so anything east of the Appalachians, though it did take place even in some parts of New York, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, even South Carolina and Georgia had some semblance of resistance to the tax that the federal government imposed in the 1790s on whiskey in particular, but it was a general tax on all distilled spirits, including beer and ale and cider. But whiskey was the primary distilled spirit because people west of the Appalachians needed to transport it east because the Spaniards controlled the Mississippi River and had laws preventing Americans from using it for commercial purposes. So it was much easier to transport whiskey and beer and cider and ale, and essentially it was easier to transport booze than it was to transport grain. So they distilled it. And in some places, because hard currency was hard to get a hold of, alcohol was used as a currency. And, there's nothing wrong with that. I'd approve of that. But anyway, so Alexander Hamilton argued in favor of this tax, and whether or not it was to prop up big businesses in the eastern part of the states, we'll never know. And remember, for the East, this means the eastern half of most of these states. We'll never know. Chances are he didn't, and it was just an unintended consequence of what he thought was a good idea in order to help pay for war debts. But as it currently stands, it wound up hurting the western halves of most of these states pretty significantly, if we're completely honest. So what happened is after a few conflicts, including a march on Pittsburgh, a small battle, and a meeting at a place now called Whiskey Point, George Washington had to round up the militias, and he called up something like 13,000 people, all told. And he tried to meet with some of the people and the leaders. And of course, he was president at the time, so here was the president leading the military. He got up and he led the military. And the people throwing the rebellion, they refused to show up. And they're like, nope, I'm out. I'm not facing George Washington, who led us through all this conflict and essentially won the War of Independence, that they were trying to model their rebellion off of. And this is the best image I could find, but it's not even that accurate if we're completely honest. But it's an image that is definitely colonial America, and that looks like a crappy drawing of George Washington, if we're completely honest, but whatever. And not colonial, early America. Apologies. So yeah, the Whiskey Rebellion was put down relatively peacefully, and it did show that the new government was willing to actually enforce the Constitution of the United States. It had only recently been put into effect, especially with George Washington at the helm. The whiskey tax was later repealed under the Jefferson administration, though it probably did more damage than good over its time, and in most places west of the Appalachians it was just completely unenforceable, notably Kentucky. So much so that Kentucky actually has a type of whiskey that is all its own, and you're not allowed to call something bourbon unless it was produced in Kentucky from primarily corn, though true bourbon is 100% corn. But that's neither here nor there, and that's just for those of us who are enthusiasts. Anyway, I hope you all enjoy. Take it easy. Have a nice day. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.